Welcome back to Session 4 of Confident Faith, Apologetics for Everyone.
The aim of this course is to strengthen your confidence and ability to engage with the heartfelt questions and concerns that people have about the Christian faith.
Over the last 2 sessions, we looked at the question, is it true? And we explored that question in relation to evidence for God and then for Christianity. In this session, we will take a new angle as we consider the next primary motivating question, is it good?
Is it good? A lot of the objections people have today about Christian faith are not so much intellectual objections as they are moral objections. And perhaps the most challenging moral objection to God's existence has to do with the question of suffering. A question that goes something like this. If God is so good or so loving, as Christians say, then why does he allow so much pain and suffering to happen? If he really cared about us, wouldn't he intervene? Wouldn't he do something about it?
Journalists usually bring out the question whenever something horrible happens in the world on a mass scale. For example, the tragedy of a school shooting or a refugee crisis or the outbreak of a pandemic. But it's not only the news items that raise the question. For suffering is an unavoidable human condition. No matter who we are, we will all experience pain, disappointment, and loss. Which is why the question of suffering is probably the most frequently raised objection to God's goodness, and which is why we have devoted this entire session to thinking about how to respond to it as Christians. So let's think through this important question together. If God is so good, why is the world so bad?
The first time I ever asked God a question like this was when I sat beside the bed of my grandmother, who'd been in an accident which had shattered the bones in her legs, piercing one of the main arteries. It meant she would slowly bleed to death internally, and there was nothing the doctors could do to operate. I sat by her as she was racked in pain, struggling to breathe, and dying what seemed to me a needlessly slow and painful death over a number of days. And as each laboured breath got worse and worse as her lungs filled with fluid, I knew that God had the power to stop this, and he didn't. Why not? Why did he allow so much pain? Why, God, why?
As difficult and as painful as this question is to face, it's not a question that takes the Bible by surprise. In John chapter 11, we read a story about a man named Lazarus who is very sick. Lazarus is a good friend of Jesus. He is the brother of Mary and Martha, who are also good friends of Jesus. So the 2 sisters naturally send word to Jesus, Lord, come quickly, the one you love is sick. Jesus gets the message, but he doesn't leave straight away. He delays. Meanwhile, the sisters sitting by Lazarus' side experience the horror of seeing Lazarus overcome by the sickness. Eventually he dies. The natural question on everyone's lips is, where was Jesus? The message was sent days and days ago, but Jesus doesn't show up. Jesus isn't there. When Jesus does eventually make it to Bethany, Lazarus has been dead a number of days. When Mary sees Jesus, she basically says to him, Lord, where were you? If you had come when we asked, my brother would not have died. But what is Jesus' response to Mary? It's neither a response of anger at her questioning, nor is it a response of disinterest in her suffering. We read in verse 35, the shortest verse in the Bible, that Jesus wept. The God of the Bible is not immune to our suffering. He cares.
As we consider the question of suffering in this session, we need to bear in mind that there are no simplistic answers here, because suffering is a deep and a profound issue, both as a question and as an experience, and one we ought to take very seriously, particularly in conversation with hurting people. It's important to know that when people are in the midst of grief and tragedy, it's not the time for giving answers. It's a time to come alongside and to be with them and to care.
But there is also at some point a time for answers, because heartfelt concerns and thoughtful questions deserve heartfelt and thoughtful answers. And although there are no easy answers, as Simon said, our faith does have helpful and meaningful things to say in response to the question of suffering. And so we would love to share with you 5 insights which, taken together, offer us good reason to continue to hope and trust in a God who loves us, even in the midst of our suffering and pain.
So firstly, The Bible affirms our instinct that the way the world is not the way that it should be.
Have you ever paused to wonder why we feel as though the way this world is, with all its pain and suffering, is not right? Or why sickness and death feel like such intruders in our world?
Because if atheism is right, and if there is no God, then the physical universe is all there is, and the way things are is just the way things are. In that sense, suffering, pain, sickness, and death should feel as natural to us as do sunshine and daisies. They should feel just as natural to us as any other part of the natural order, but of course they don't.
In other words, atheism can't make sense of our instinct that something is wrong with the world, but Christianity can. The Bible confirms the cry of our hearts that the way this world is not the way it should be, and it tells us why.
It explains that the moral freedom God gave us to choose love, we've used to reject God's love and His wisdom, and that our relationships have fractured as a result. Our relationships with God, with others, with nature, and even with ourselves. This is what theologians call the fall, the beginning of sin. A doctrine, points out the writer G.K. Chesterton, that's been empirically validated by over 2,000 years of human history.
The second point we would make is that suffering does not disprove a loving God.
The argument that suffering disproves the existence of a good God is not considered by most philosophers today to be a sound argument because of the free will defense, which holds that the best of all possible worlds is a world that allows for love. But in order for God to create a world that allows for love, it must be a world full of creatures who have the ability to love and therefore who have morally significant free will. Because love that is not freely given is not truly love. But for creatures to possess genuine moral freedom means that those creatures must also be granted the freedom to choose to reject God and His love, to choose to live selfishly rather than lovingly.
Now, God could create a world without any evil and suffering by instead creating automatons, creatures without free will who always do the right thing like pre-programmed robots. But then such a world would allow no space for love. Therefore, the best of all possible worlds is arguably a world that, in allowing for the possibility of love, must also allow for the reality of freedom, and therefore the possibility of pain.
Which is what the Bible says.
Thirdly, not all suffering is all bad.
Yeah, a friend of mine grew up in Nepal. His parents were medical missionaries who treated people with leprosy. And he explained to me that leprosy is caused by a bacteria that destroys nerve endings so that a person loses the ability to feel pain. And it's not the leprosy that causes deformity in hands and feet. It's the persistent injuries that occur as a result of the person being unable to experience pain. They stub their toe and don't realize it, or put their hand in the fire and don't feel it.
Now, in the modern West, we are accustomed to thinking of pain and suffering as our greatest enemies, with no upside whatsoever. And that's because we're accustomed to thinking of happiness through the simplistic lens of pain minimization and pleasure maximization. And so we imagine that if God exists, He should create a world without pain or suffering. When a secular culture sees the meaning of life in being able to be free to do whatever you want whenever you want to, it's not surprising that it sees all suffering as meaningless and cruel.
But as any psychologist will attest, suffering does help us grow as human beings. It helps us, for example, to develop patience and wisdom, as well as compassion and understanding towards others.
On a similar note, the writer John Eldridge once said, "I don't trust a man who hasn't suffered."
Something else suffering sometimes does as well is cause people to seriously consider God's existence, often for the first time. The atheist philosopher Luke Ferry observes that it's our experiences of heartbreak, tragedy, and suffering more than anything else in this life that incline us to consider whether in fact there is more to life than just this life, whether in fact there is a God.
C.S. Lewis echoes this idea when he writes, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pain. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world."
So as you can see, the existence of pain and suffering in the world is not all bad, and of course, nor is it all good. What we're saying is that the reality is far more nuanced. suffering in a way forces us to think about what life is really all about. As much as it causes many to question the existence of a loving God, it is just as true that it causes many who've never given God a second thought to think again and maybe even pray.
Fourthly, God himself suffers with us. C.S. Lewis tragically lost his mother when just a boy. He describes himself as a young man before he became a Christian, as one who is living in a whirl of contradictions. He writes, "I maintained that God did not exist. I was also very angry with God for not existing, and I was equally angry with God for creating such a world as this."
The simple truth is that suffering gets no easier when we get rid of God. In the midst of suffering, we don't need a better philosophy. We need a friend who loves us and who truly understands what we're going through. And the God of the Bible truly understands. For as the Russian novelist Dostoevsky observed while staring at a painting of Jesus' body, no other God has scars.
The cross is God's answer to a hurting world. On the cross, we encounter a God who is willing to identify with us to such an extent that he has bodily entered into our world of suffering, experiencing what it is not only to be hungry, cold, tired, but also misunderstood, betrayed, rejected, humiliated, tortured, and killed. On the cross, he takes the penalty of our sin and pays for it with his own blood. And because of the cross, you and I are free to return to God and find forgiveness and fulfillment in relationship with him.
In the Bible, when God's people are about to go through a challenging time, we read that God often encourages them with a certain phrase. The phrase begins with, "Fear not." But God doesn't say, "Fear not because I will do something for you."
No, he says, "Fear not, for I will be with you." When one is suffering, these 5 words, "I will be with you," can make all the difference in the world.
I remember being with our then 18-month-old daughter, Grace, when she went to the hospital to get her immunisation needles. And Tash told me that she would find it too difficult to watch the whole thing happen.
That's right.
It really isn't pleasant seeing someone stick a giant needle into your child's arm. So she graciously volunteered for me to do the job. And I remember feeling nervous about how Grace would react to the needle and what she would think of me, her loving father, when she saw that I had allowed her to be hurt. You see, your job as the parent is to sit your child on your lap and make them feel as relaxed and comfortable as possible with what's going on so the nurse can safely stick the needle in. In other words, those nurses make you entirely complicit with the act. So as Grace was happily sitting on my lap, smiling at me and smiling at the nurse with the pretty and shiny, pointy, sharp object in her hand, I braced myself for what I knew would be a shock to Grace. And as that needle went in, and Grace's face went instantly red, shifting from an expression of contentment to one of shock and pain, I kept my eyes on her eyes, afraid I would read in her face the fear that somehow I, who was allowing this to happen, no longer loved her. But thankfully, I never saw that look. But what I did see in the expression of her now tear-stained face was the question, "Why? Why, Daddy? Given that I know that you love me, why are you allowing this to happen?" And the reality was that Grace was of an age such that even if I'd tried to explain it to her, she wouldn't have understood. But the fact that an 18-month-old did not have the capacity to understand why any good parent would allow a stranger to painfully stick a needle into her arm didn't mean that there were no good reasons. I knew that one day she would possess the capacity to understand, but that for now, all she had to go on was her trust in me. But her trust was not an unreasonable trust. It was not a blind faith. It was a faith in me based on the evidence of my love for her from the very first day of her life.
Similarly, Christianity holds that we can trust God, does have good reasons for allowing to happen what happens in this life, even if we ourselves can't understand them. That he is wise and he is good, and that one day we will understand, but not today, and in all likelihood, not in this lifetime. Someone may object and say that this is just blind faith, but according to the Bible, it's not. It's a faith based on the evidence of God's love for us in Jesus Christ, our suffering Saviour.
As Tim Keller writes, we may not know the exact reason why we suffer in any given instance, but one thing our suffering cannot mean, in light of the cross, it cannot mean that God doesn't love us.
Fifthly and finally, one day there shall be no more suffering. Just as God's suffering on the cross through Christ reminds us that this world is not the way it should be, so too his resurrection from the grave assures us that this world will one day be restored to what it should be.
It is true that if this life is all there is, then we're without hope in a world of pain and of suffering and of death over which we have no ultimate control. But according to the Bible, this life is not all there is. There is hope and meaning beyond this world and life, beyond it but not separate to it. This life is a chapter in our story, but the final chapter hasn't happened yet.
Like Mary weeping at the feet of Jesus in response to Lazarus' death, we are only midway through the story. Mary thought it was the end, but it wasn't, because in the midst of a grieving community, when all hope seems lost, Jesus walks to the tomb of Lazarus and he cries out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And to the wonderment of all, Lazarus, now raised to life, does exactly that. And in the blink of an eye, tears of sadness turn into tears of joy.
Like Mary and Martha, now we grieve, but only for a little while longer. For one day, the world will be restored to what it should be. One day, Jesus will wipe away every tear. One day, the sting of suffering will be removed. One day, all will be restored. One day, all that is wrong will be put right. One day, in the words of Sam Gamgee from The Lord of the Rings, all that is sad in the world will come untrue.
And in the meantime, Jesus calls us to trust him, even in the midst of disappointments and pain so terrible we cannot help but cry out to God in frustration and in tears. But even then, we can trust him. Not only because, let's face it, where else have we to go? But also because the one who promises to be with us is worthy of our trust, and he has the scars to prove it.
Right now is a good place for you to pause this session. Take a moment to reflect upon your own experience and share your thoughts in relation to the question of suffering and the responses to it offered by the Christian faith. Please do remember that for many this question is deeply personal. And so we would encourage you to be sensitive as you share with each other. Welcome back to the final part of this session.
Having considered the question of suffering, if God is so good, why is his world so bad? We are now going to consider a related question which we have noticed is being asked more and more by people today, which is, if God is so good, then why is his church so bad? Why, for example, are churches so often full of people who are arrogant, legalistic, bigoted, and hypocritical? For a lot of people, the good news of Christianity has been obscured by the bad behavior of Christians, and particularly of high-profile Christian leaders whose moral failings often leave vast swathes of people feeling disenchanted and disillusioned.
Others, also pointing to historical failures, ask why, if Christianity is so good, was the Bible used to justify slavery in the American South, or the French and Spanish Inquisitions, or the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries that decimated Europe, or the historical cover-up of abuse in Christian institutions, which sadly is an ongoing issue still today?
To anyone asking these sorts of questions, whether from inside or outside the church, we would offer 4 brief points of response. And again, these responses are not so much a complete answer or solution to the problem as they are a framework for the beginning of a helpful response and meaningful conversation.
The first is simply to say to the person asking the question, "You're right. You're right. There isn't really anything good about the church failing to live up to its own teaching. The Bible itself speaks powerfully against hypocrisy and judgmentalism and double standards, and so there really is no good excuse when such things are done in the name of Christianity."
The second is simply to say, I am so sorry, particularly if you or someone you love has been treated cruelly or unfairly by someone calling themselves a Christian. Because Jesus himself is not like that at all. And it would be a tragedy for anyone to miss out on knowing the love of Jesus in their life because of the way someone who calls themselves a follower of Jesus has acted.
The third is to highlight that if we are to judge Christian faith or any belief fairly, we should be careful not to judge it by its abuse. If I can use an imperfect analogy, imagine that you or somebody that you love is attacked by a gang of football hooligans. Would this be a good reason to give up loving football? Well, the answer to that question would depend, would it not, on a further question, which is there something about the game of football that lends itself to hooliganism, or does the problem of hooliganism in football stem from somewhere other than football?
The question for us, I think, is similar. Is there something about Christianity that lends itself to evil and abusive behavior? Or does the problem of evil and abusive behavior stem from somewhere other than Christianity?
And in order to answer that question, we should begin by asking, what is it that Jesus Christ himself actually taught about how we ought to live and how we ought to treat one another? Well, in his very first and most famous sermon, Jesus declared that it's the poor in spirit, the meek, those who've been persecuted, and the peacemakers who are blessed. He teaches his disciples not to return violence with violence, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also.
It makes me think about how even when Jesus was being flogged, stripped naked, spat on, laughed at, and nailed to a cross, he did not resist. Instead, he prayed, Father, forgive them. And his example has inspired millions of Christians throughout history to love their neighbours and even their enemies in the most trying of circumstances.
In fact, one of the things that got everybody's attention in Christianity's early days was how well these Jesus followers loved their neighbours. The Roman Emperor Julian, who hated Christians and wanted to remove their influence from his empire, in a letter to an official wrote these words: "Why then do we Romans not observe how the kindness of Christians to strangers and the sobriety of their lifestyle has done the most to advance their cause? It is disgraceful when no Jew is a beggar and the Christians support our poor in addition to their own."
Now, sadly, the church has not always lived up to the teaching of the Bible. Sadly, Christendom has not always been faithful to Christianity, and terrible things have been done by people calling themselves Christians. However, it is also true that whenever human atrocities have been committed in the name of Christianity, it has been done in direct violation of Jesus' own teaching to love not only our neighbours, but even our enemies. And so if we are going to judge Christianity fairly, we should be careful not to judge it by its abuse.
Fourthly and finally, the heart of the problem is not God, it's us. Where bad things have been done in the name of Christianity, this speaks not to the inherent wickedness of Christianity, but of the human heart, which would try to twist even a religion of love into an instrument of hate. In other words, the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. But that's the exact problem that Christ came into the world to save us from, the problem of ourselves, which is why Jesus is not the cause of the world's problems. He is the answer to our deepest problem, the problem of evil in the human heart.
But as the famed children's show host Fred Rogers once said, the only thing that evil cannot stand is forgiveness. Through Jesus Christ, we can know not only forgiveness with God, but also forgiveness from and for each other in a world that is so desperately in need of both. And so Jesus is not the cause of all that is wrong with the world. He is the answer to all that is wrong with the world, for he alone is utterly and completely good.
Well, thank you so much for journeying with us in this session as we've looked together at the question, is it good, in the context of one of the biggest challenges to the notion that God is good, which is the presence of pain and suffering in the world, as well as in the church and as well as caused by the church. We really hope this session has helped you to thoughtfully engage with these tough questions, both in relation to your own faith, as well as in the context of sharing your faith with others.
So far in our journey, we've looked at the question, is it true? We've looked today, is it good? In our next session, we're going to tackle the third of our questions, which is, does it work? This has been Confident Faith, Apologetics for Everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this journey, and we look forward to seeing you in our next session.